It's the All Aussie Rules Football Podcast. Welcome on back. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at every game of the AFL 2025 season. Stick around and find out how your team will go. Welcome on in, everybody, to the All Aussie Rules Football Podcast. This is episode 7 of 2025. We're flying through. We're nearly at the start of the season. It's only 2 weeks away, plus one extra day at time of release of this video. Thanks for tuning in once again. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all of those things. Whether you're watching this on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcast, don't forget to rate it. Don't forget to comment. A little plan for today's episode. I'll have a quick look at news. Some pre-season games have started, some match simulations. We're not going to go deep dive into them yet. That will be in next week's episode 8. So come back for that one. That will be out early next week. But we'll have a quick look at them, a little look at the latest news in football this week, and then we're going to jump in and predict every single match of the home and away season 2025. And have a look at who's going to be in contention, according to me. Of course, if I knew exactly what was going to happen, I would be very, very rich. Because, let's be honest, that would be easy. But we're just going to have a look at what I think will happen. So, latest news, I guess. We've had, as I said, a few match simulations. There's been 3 match simulations plus the Indigenous All-Stars game on Saturday night. So first up we had the Bombers taking on the Bulldogs on Saturday afternoon. The Dons looked pretty good throughout that one. I think they were closer to full strength than the Bulldogs were. Obviously no Bont, no a few other players, but also Bulldogs are going to be missing players early this season as well. So they're going to have a very interesting start to their year, I think. But the Dons looked ready to go. It's only pre-season. It doesn't overly matter too much. But some of their young players did perform pretty well. So we'll have a full wrap-up of that game next week's episode, as I said. But positive signs for sure from the Dons on Saturday. Then Saturday night we had the Indigenous All-Stars game against Fremantle. And it was quite a bit of entertainment, in all honesty. It was only one team obviously cared too much about it. Fremantle are more about just getting mileage in their legs, a little bit of game touch. But they certainly weren't anywhere near their best. I know Longmuir was like, oh, we're not going to show what we've got. Don't read into that too much. But, like, the players clearly did not care about the match as much as what the opposition did. And that's fine. They're not winning premierships in pre-season week 1, are you? So, don't read too much into Fremantle. They obviously, the game plan that they're going to bring would not be something that would probably match up too well against the All-Stars anyway. Indigenous All-Stars always going to be a fast team. Runs the ball, carries the ball, bounces the ball, kicks a lot of goals. And that's probably not ideal for Fremantle anyway. So, it was still an okay hit out. Some of their star players looked like they're ready to go this year. Sarong started really well. So, positive signs nonetheless. We'll look into that game again a bit more next week. But Indigenous All-Stars looked really good. Simpkin got best on ground. He was outstanding. Horne-Francis had plenty of it. He was playing half-forward flank mostly. Bobby Hill kicked 4 goals. Could have probably kicked 6, in all honesty. Missed a couple sitters. But just, overall, Indigenous All-Stars looked fantastic. Next up, we had 2 games on Monday. The first one was a 9:30 start over in the West, between West Coast and Richmond. 2 teams without, I guess, too much hope for this season. Maybe there's a little bit of hope on the West Coast side, but I don't think too many people expect them to do too much in 2025. And the game certainly played that way when that first quarter was... Well, they played 3 periods for starters, 3 25-minute periods. The first one was an absolute battle to get through. I was like, wowee, what are we watching here? It was about 7-7 or 7-6 or something like that. The one highlight was Sam Lawler. Almost couldn't speak. For Richmond, number 1 draft pick last year. He came out and kicked their first goal, which was a good upside for them. Outside of that, Richmond had a terrible day. West Coast absolutely dominated the second period and controlled the third. And to make things worse, Richmond have come out with 2 injuries. One to Lawler, who kicked another goal and looked really quite good. But he's, I believe, broken his jaw or something along those lines. So potentially will be missing the start of the season. We'll have to wait and see. And I think, I haven't actually looked, but I think Ralph Smith might have potentially looked like he did a hammy. I haven't followed that up, but there'll be a little bit of a look at that, I guess, as well. So not an ideal day for Richmond, and they lost by about 40 points in the end as well. So certainly not what they wanted over in the West. 2 weeks out from the season starting, but West Coast side of things looked really good, and I think they're ready to go. Obviously not a team that's expected to do too well, but I think an improvement on last year is certainly on the cards for them. However, they do also have a couple injury concerns from before the practice game that might affect them a little bit heading into the season. We've had one more match sim that started before that one finished. It was down at the Cattery, Geelong Hawthorn, 2 teams that probably do have high hopes for this year. One made a prelim and the other one got knocked out in a semi-final last year. And it looked like a cracking game, in all honesty. Quite a lot of free-flowing scoring. Ollie Henry kicked 4 goals up forward for the Cats. The Hawthorn midfield looked really good. The Geelong midfield was not at full strength, and certainly not as much as Hawthorn. Hawthorn were basically full strength across the board. And both teams looked pretty good, though. The ball movement was quite good. As I said, the midfield for Hawthorn looked good. The clearance work was really good from Hawthorn. But Geelong kind of controlled most of the game, certainly in that first period and a bit. Kicked poorly. Hawthorn came into it, but then Geelong managed to get away a little bit towards the end and end up winning by like 10 points or 15 points or something. I can't remember exactly, but we'll do a deep dive into all of those games, plus the remaining ones from the first week of Match Sim that haven't been played yet, all in next week's episode. So make sure you come back for that. That will be going live on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts next Monday. That will be episode 8 of 2025, so stick around for that. Let's jump now into every match of 2025. Who's going to win them? Who's going to lose them? We're going to go through them right now. And opening round starts with this. So, little FYI, there will be little snippets of ladders shown in amongst this, which will show wins and losses, obviously. But I did not put any margins in any of these matches for a couple reasons. The main one being I couldn't be bothered. Secondly, who knows what's going to happen? So every team that finishes on the same amount of wins is going to have the exact same percentage. So when we get to the end of the year, it's going to be in blocks. Yeah, this amount of wins, this amount of wins, this amount of wins. And we'll go through that when we get up to it, though. First off, opening round, we got Brisbane, Geelong. I'm not going to say, we're going to have to do it quite quick because we don't want to be sitting here for the next hour and a half going through every result. But we'll go through as many as we can. Brisbane will beat Geelong. I've gone home teams in opening round. In all honesty, all 4 of these could go either way. I think I've gone the favourites in all 4 for now, and likely to start favourites. The only one that potentially won't start favourite there is Sydney. Hawthorn could end up being favourites there. We'll see how the pre-season goes, I guess. But I've gone the 4 home teams to win the opening round. We'll see how that plays out. This is round 1. Carlton should take care of Richmond. What else is there interesting? Hawthorn to beat Essendon, Geelong to beat Freo, Big game, Sydney-Brisbane, that one. I've gone Brisbane over Sydney at the SCG. I think Brisbane are going to be the better team this year. Although Sydney do play SCG well, so who knows. Collingwood to beat Port Adelaide in Melbourne. Bulldogs to beat North Melbourne at Marvel Stadium. Adelaide to take care of St Kilda in what is a very important game for both clubs. Melbourne to beat GWS in Melbourne. And Eagles to take care of the Suns at Optus Stadium. Round 2, we're going Hawthorn against Carlton at the MCG. That will be a huge Thursday night game of football. Collingwood to beat the Bulldogs at the MCG. Essendon to take care of the Crows at the MCG. Port Adelaide beating Richmond. Geelong at Marvel Stadium to beat St Kilda. That'll be a close game, I reckon. That will be an absolute ripper and a pretty important game for both teams early season. Brisbane will be too good for West Coast. Melbourne to beat North Melbourne at Marvel Stadium, but depending what Melbourne's looking like early season, that might be one that we flip. And Fremantle to beat Sydney over at Optus Stadium, but who knows? Fremantle should be better this year. I don't see Sydney being as good as they were in the home away season last year, so I'm reasonable with that one. The next round, we've got Essendon to beat Port Adelaide in Melbourne. Carlton looking better than Bulldogs early season, I think, here. Melbourne to beat Gold Coast. St Kilda beat Richmond. Hawthorn too good for GWS down in Tassie on a Saturday night. Adelaide to beat North Melbourne. And Fremantle to beat West Coast. Next round, we go Collingwood-Carlton. Now, it should be a cracking game. Collingwood have had the wood on them the last year or so I'm going Collingwood. But certainly one that could go either way. Geelong to beat Melbourne. Gold Coast should take care of Adelaide up on the Gold Coast. Brisbane will take care of Richmond. Big game here. Kangaroos, Sydney. I've gone Sydney to beat them. GWS should beat the Eagles. Port Adelaide at home against the Saints. And Fremantle beating the Doggies over there in the West. So once every team has played 4 games, this is how I have the ladder. As you can see, once again, as I mentioned beforehand, percentage is going to be the same for each amount of wins. So ignore the percentage. 4 from 4, we got Brisbane. Then the next rung is teams that are 3 and 1. Collingwood, Fremantle, Geelong, Hawthorn, Melbourne. Teams that split the games 2 and 2. Adelaide, Carlton, Essendon, GWS, Gold Coast, Port Adelaide and Sydney. Teams that went 1 and 3. St Kilda, West Coast and the Bulldogs, and the 2 teams that went 0 and 4, North Melbourne and Richmond. We continue on with the next round. Adelaide to beat Geelong over in the at Adelaide Oval. Collingwood to beat Sydney at Adelaide Oval. This is obviously gather round. All games in South Australia. Gold Coast to beat North Melbourne. That'll be an interesting game. Gold Coast didn't travel well last year, so it could be one that the Kangaroos can steal. Kangaroos certainly look like they should be a better team in 2025 than they were in 2024. Next one, Brisbane beat the Bulldogs. Bulldogs look like they're going to have a tough start to the year, but I could be completely wrong on that. Melbourne to beat the Dons over at Adelaide Oval. Melbourne travelled well to Adelaide well last year. They won 2 games, 2 from 2 over there. Whereas Essendon have had a little bit of trouble with Melbourne over recent seasons, I think. So I'm going Melbourne there. Fremantle to beat Richmond. Richmond probably will win a game this year, but who knows which one it will be. GWS, St Kilda should be a cracker. They played an absolute ripper game last year where GWS, with 5 goals up in the last quarter. And St Kilda came back and almost stole it. And Port Adelaide and Hawthorn also played multiple rippers last year. They certainly played... Did they play 3 games or twice? Certainly played at Adelaide Oval twice last year. And both times Port Adelaide won by less than a kick. So Sunday evening of gather round will be an absolute cracker, one to watch. I've gone Port Adelaide, but both teams should be right in that one. Next up, it's Easter weekend, and I've gone Brisbane to beat Collingwood. Then we got Carlton should take care of North Melbourne. Bombers over in the West against West Coast. That could be a close game, though. It was close last year between both these two teams in the West. Melbourne to beat Freo. Adelaide to beat GWS in Adelaide. Richmond to go down to Gold Coast. Sydney to beat Port. St Kilda at Marvel Stadium against the Doggies. And the Cats Hawks game at the MCG should be a ripper. I've gone Cats, but either of those two teams could certainly win that one. Next round, we've gone all home team this week. Melbourne to beat Richmond. Collingwood, Essendon in the Anzac Day clash. I've gone Collingwood. Once again, could go either way. Fremantle to beat Adelaide in the West on Anzac Day night, which should be a cracking game. St Kilda against Brisbane, just because it's at Marvel Stadium. Brisbane don't play Marvel spectacularly well. No, they're not terrible there, but St Kilda are usually pretty good there. Port Adelaide to beat North Melbourne. GWS should beat the Doggies at Manuka, but should is always very not very common to actually happen in the end. Gold Coast, Sydney, Gold Coast at home. Carlton to beat Cats at the MCG in what should be a Sunday afternoon cracker. And then the other Sunday evening game is Hawthorn West Coast. We've gone Hawthorn to get that one. Following week, we go Essendon over Kangaroos at Marvel Stadium. St Kilda to beat Fremantle in Melbourne. Bulldogs against Port Adelaide. Adelaide to beat Carlton in Adelaide. Geelong beating Collingwood at the MCG. They had the wood over them last year, Geelong, so we'll see how that plays out. West Coast to beat the Demons, which is a big call, but over in the West. Sydney in the battle for the bridge against GWS. Hawthorn to beat Richmond at home at the MCG. Obviously, both teams play MCG. I think that's a fairly obvious one. And Brisbane to beat Gold Coast in the Q Clash at the Gabba. Move into the next round. We're going Fremantle hosting Collingwood to win. Carlton to beat St Kilda because it's at the MCG. Hawthorn beating Melbourne. Should be a good game there. Saturday afternoon football. Essendon, Sydney at the Marvel should be Essendon. Gold Coast to beat the Doggies up in Darwin because last year Gold Coast played that ground so spectacularly well. So we're going them. Port Adelaide to beat Adelaide in the first of their meetings. West Coast to beat Richmond. West Coast over in Melbourne, you're not going to be too confident too often, but it's hard to see Richmond winning many this year. Geelong to beat GWS down at the Cattery, and down in Hobart, Brisbane should be way too good for North Melbourne. Then we got Gold Coast to be too good for Hawthorn. As I said, Gold Coast played up there so well last year, so I've got faith that they could beat Hawthorn, which, just on the side note, would have them sitting second on the ladder after whatever round this is, about round 10 or 11, which is huge if they actually are up there. Sydney should be too good for Carlton, Collingwood to beat Adelaide in Melbourne. Port Adelaide beating Geelong in over there. GWS hosting Fremantle and winning. Bulldogs to beat the Bombers at Marvel, but that one could go either way. Bombers did beat them quite easily last year at Marvel Stadium, so take that with a grain of salt. North Melbourne should be too good for Richmond on Sunday. Brisbane to beat Melbourne at home, and West Coast to host St Kilda and win. Gives us Geelong Bulldogs on a Thursday night at the Cattery. Geelong too good. Essendon should be way too good for Richmond. That Friday night game is not going to be one causing too much excitement, I wouldn't have thought. Carlton beating GWS. Hawthorn to beat Brisbane at the MCG in what should be a good game. Marvel Stadium, Collingwood and North Melbourne, sorry. I almost tipped North Melbourne in this, but we went with Collingwood. Fremantle to beat Port Adelaide over in the West. Adelaide hosting West Coast and winning. Melbourne hosting Sydney and beating them. And St Kilda against Gold Coast at Marvel Stadium going the way of the Saints. Next up, so that's halfway through the year. Every team has had 2 buys at this point. No, this is just before the second buys start, sorry. So this is after, 11 games, obviously. Before every team has their second bye. Teams record here, we got Brisbane 9-2. Then we got Carlton, Collingwood, Fremantle, Geelong, Gold Coast, Hawthorn and Melbourne, all 8. 7. 7 wins and 4 losses. So 2 games behind the Brisbane Lions. And then Adelaide, Essendon, Port Adelaide on 6 and 5. GWS, St Kilda, Sydney 5 and 6. West Coast 4 and 7. Bulldogs 3 and 8. North Melbourne 1 and 10. And Richmond 0 and 11. Into the bye weeks we go. Brisbane to beat Essendon. Hawthorn to beat Collingwood at the MCG. Gold Coast too good for Freo. GWS beating Richmond. Sydney beating Adelaide. Melbourne beating St Kilda. And Geelong should be able to take care of West Coast over in the West. Week 2 of the byes, and we got Bulldogs, Hawthorn at Marvel, and I went Bulldogs. At MCG, I would have tipped Hawthorn. Although, having said that, Hawthorn did beat the Bulldogs at Marvel Stadium last year. So that one probably could go the other way. But we've locked in for the Bulldogs. Adelaide to beat Brisbane. Sydney beat Richmond. Geelong to beat Gold Coast. GWS to beat Port Adelaide. West Coast to beat North Melbourne. But that one could go either way, but it is over in the West. So I am going to back the Eagles in. Carlton to beat the Bombers. And Collingwood to win the King's birthday game against the Demons. St Kilda to beat the Doggies. Down in Friday night footy in Launceston. Hawthorn to beat Adelaide. Brisbane to beat GWS. Essendon to beat Geelong. Freo too good for the Kangaroos because once again it's over in the West. Port Adelaide beating Melbourne and Carlton too strong for the Eagles. Next round is Freo too good for Essendon over there. Geelong beating Brisbane at the Cattery. The Blues beating North Melbourne. Port Adelaide beating Sydney. Collingwood beating St Kilda at Marvel Stadium in what could be a cracker Saturday night fixture. GWS too good in the Expansion Cup. And Bulldogs beating Richmond. We're now into games that we don't know what day they play. The schedule obviously will be released in about 4 or 5 weeks before this probably. Collingwood to beat West Coast. Hawthorn to absolutely demolish North Melbourne down at Utah Stadium. Adelaide beating Richmond. Sydney beating Bulldogs. Gold Coast beating Melbourne. Port Adelaide taking care of Carlton. And Freo beating St Kilda. Which, after the bye rounds, 15 matches for every team. This is how I now have it in their brackets. Brisbane at 11-4, so a little bit of a rough patch for them there, losing 2 games in the last 4 games. Carlton, Collingwood, Fremantle, Geelong, Hawthorn, all at 10-5. Gold Coast, Port Adelaide at 9-6. Adelaide, GWS, Melbourne, Sydney, all sitting at 8-7. Essendon at 7-8. St Kilda at 6-9. West Coast and Bulldogs both at 5-10. North Melbourne at 1-14. And Richmond at 0-15. We come out of the bye and we go Brisbane beating Port Adelaide up there. Carlton beating Collingwood. Essendon beating Gold Coast. Another cracker round this one. Geelong should be way too good for Richmond. Bulldogs, North Melbourne, we've gone Bulldogs. Hawthorn, St Kilda. This could be a sneaky good game to watch, this one. St Kilda's form at Marvel is usually pretty good. Hawthorn probably overall better at the MCG, but you think they'd take care of it, so I've gone them. Sydney beating Freo. Adelaide beating Melbourne. And GWS to beat the West Coast Eagles. Carlton to beat Brisbane in Melbourne. Melbourne beating North. Essendon beating Richmond. St Kilda taking care of the Swans at Marvel. Bulldogs hosting the Crows and winning. Gold Coast beating the Pies. GWS beating the Cats. Port Adelaide beating West Coast. And maybe game of the round, Fremantle hosting Hawthorn and getting the win. The next week is another one that we've gone for all home teams. Brisbane against Port Adelaide, Carlton against Melbourne, Collingwood against Fremantle, Bombers against GWS in what should be a cracker. Another one here, Geelong hosting St Kilda. Hawthorn hosting Port Adelaide down in Tassie and getting the job done. Sydney beating North. Melbourne should be pretty easy. Adelaide beating Gold Coast, and Fremantle against... No, that's not Fremantle. That's West Coast against Richmond getting the win. We're getting close to the end of the season now. Essendon beating Bulldogs. Hawthorn to beat Carlton. A couple away wins here. Geelong against North Melbourne and Collingwood against Richmond. And then straight back into the home winners. St Kilda against Melbourne. Gold Coast against Brisbane. GWS against Sydney. Adelaide against Port Adelaide. Fremantle against West Coast. We move into another round and another week that I've picked all the home teams. Collingwood against Brisbane, Geelong against Port, Melbourne against West Coast, St Kilda against North, Bulldogs to take care of GWS at Marvel, Sydney to beat Essendon, Gold Coast to beat Richmond, Adelaide to beat Hawthorn, which should be a cracking game, and the Freo Dockers to beat the Blues. Next up, we got Brisbane beating Sydney, Carlton against Gold Coast, Geelong against the Bombers, Hawthorn against Collingwood, Melbourne against the Bulldogs. St Kilda should be too strong for Richmond. GWS beating Kangaroos. Port Adelaide beating Fremantle. West Coast beating Adelaide. Next we've got Carlton. Back to all home winners again. Carlton against Port. Essendon against St Kilda. Hawthorn against Melbourne. North against Richmond. Western Bulldogs against the Eagles. Sydney against the Cats. Gold Coast beating GWS in the second of the expansion cup for the year. Adelaide hosting Collingwood and winning. And Fremantle beating the Lions over in the west. Lions beating Hawthorn, Collingwood hosting and winning against Melbourne. Essendon beating Carlton. That should be a cracking game. And in all honesty, one that I'm surprised I went with Essendon. But hey, strange things happen in football. North to beat Adelaide, which should be a interesting match. Geelong will smack Richmond to all ends of the park. Bulldogs to beat Freo. GWS to beat St Kilda. Port Adelaide beating Gold Coast and West Coast beating Sydney. Which, that is the end of the season. 23 rounds, and there is the ladder. As I said, they're in blocks because we didn't do percentages. But Geelong sit on top at 16 and 7 for the season. Pretty good record. 3 teams sit one game behind them. Brisbane, Carlton and Hawthorn all sitting at 15 and 8. So fairly confident with those 4 teams going through to finals. Next up, one game behind them on 14 wins are Collingwood and Fremantle. So they're in that next block. 6 teams reasonably safely through. Then you've got 4 teams that will be fighting for that last couple spots according to my schedule, nothing else. They are Adelaide, Essendon, GWS and Gold Coast all sitting on 13 wins and 10 losses. Obviously that's in alphabetical order because we didn't do percentages. So it could be any 2 of those 4, which would be huge if it's any of them really. Adelaide haven't played finals for a few years now. Essendon haven't won a final in a long time. GWS are probably the least exciting of those 4 to make it, because then Gold Coast have never played in a final before. So if 3 of those make finals, that would be huge. After that, we've got teams on 12 wins, which is Port Adelaide and Sydney, 12 and 11. Melbourne on 11 and 12. St Kilda and Bulldogs both finishing 10 and 13. West Coast getting to 8 wins and 15, which would be a pretty good season for them. North Melbourne just 3 wins and 20 losses. They probably want a couple more than 3 in all honesty. And the Tigers, I've got them not winning a game. They probably will win a game at some point somewhere, but who knows which one it is. So if this was to be the ladder, okay, ignoring things could change obviously because of this is in alphabetical order. Geelong finishing on top, I think I safely say that based on my results here. It's not safe to say that that's what's going to happen, but safe to say that they are the top team based on what I think. So they would host a qualifying final and be playing against Brisbane, Carlton or Hawthorn. Let's just say it goes in that order. Geelong Hawthorn would be a massive qualifying final. And Brisbane Carlton, they've had a bit of a finals rivalry over the last couple of years. You go back 2 years ago, Brisbane won the prelim only just over Carlton. And then last year again, they met each other in a final, in an elimination final, and Brisbane absolutely demolished them. So a bit of a rivalry developing, and it's always going the way of the Lions. So that will be an interesting matchup there. And then in the elimination finals, Collingwood against Essendon would be huge, but I mean, Collingwood against anyone would be pretty massive there. Fremantle hosting either Adelaide, Essendon, GWS or Gold Coast would all be quite interesting matchups as well. So take this how you will, but we've narrowed it down to 10 teams there to play finals. Granted, Port Adelaide, Sydney, Melbourne, St Kilda Bulldogs are all capable of playing finals. Don't take this as me writing them off, because it's not at all. But based on the matches that we've just gone through, we've narrowed it down to 10. We're going to say the top 6 are through, and then 7, 8, 9, and 10, we can't decide yet. A little playoff maybe between them to see how it goes. A little bit like an NBA-style playoff play-in tournament. So, yeah, that's my every match predicted. Let me know what you think down the bottom in the comments. I know, I'm probably going to cop some abuse about some of these tips that I've done. Just remember, nobody knows what's going to happen. As I said all of last year, I think the competition is closer now than it ever has been. And I think this year it's looking like it's going to be even closer than it was last year. I seriously think every team from 15 and above on that ladder can hypothetically have a realistic, really, really hot chance of making finals. And vice versa. Everyone in that top 15 can miss finals quite easily with a bit of bad luck of getting injuries at the wrong time, or just having a bad run of games where you just kind of have the injuries for the wrong matchups or whatever it is. Luck will play a big part in it, and who knows what's actually going to happen. But if any of this comes true, I will let you all know at the end of the season. Don't you worry about that. So that is my every match predicted. I don't think I have much else to say for today. Don't forget, though, if you're stuck around, check out the other videos on the YouTube channel. Head over there if you're on one of the other platforms, at All Aussie Rules. We have videos going live every day throughout February. That's every weekday. Season previews of every club. We're past the halfway mark. Melbourne came out yesterday. North Melbourne will be coming out tomorrow. There's a ton of content over on the YouTube channel, so I'm really spruiking that at the moment, so head over there, check that out. Once again, thank you for tuning in, for giving me your time. I appreciate you. Hit the sub button if you haven't already, and I'll catch you next week for episode 8. Catch you then.